Welcome, everyone. We are really glad that you were able to join us today for this informational session on perfluorinated substances, or PFAS, which I'll be using from now on. I'm Lisa Peterson, and I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, and I study the causes of cancer. I am also one of the lead investigators of the 10,000 Family Cancer Study. The 10,000 Family Study, or 10KFS for short, is a research study of family health in Minnesota. It is a long-term study, also called a cohort study, that was launched in 2017 out of the University of Minnesota. We are looking for how the environment, genetics, and lifestyle affects health and illness over time. A family study is the perfect way to look at these three things. We are recruiting families from all communities across the state in both greater Minnesota and the metro area so that we can discover how these factors influence health across the state. Right now, we have a grant from the National Cancer Institute to look at exposures to some chemicals in the environment and whether they are associated with blood cancers, which are elevated in our state. One group of chemicals we are studying are the PFAS. This is why we've invited Sara Fossen Johnson to answer questions about this class of chemicals today. Dr. Johnson is an expert on PFAS. She is the manager of the Environmental Surveillance and Assessment section at the Minnesota Department of Health. She trained in public health at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health and Harvard University. She has spent more than 15 years working on drinking water contamination issues and human health at MDH, with more than a decade of it spent as a part of a team that developed health-based water guidance values for contaminants found in groundwater in Minnesota, including PFAS. The format of our conversation today will be an interview where I will ask Dr. Johnson some questions about PFAS. This will then be followed by some information about the 10,000 Family Study and how you can participate. We will conclude with an opportunity for you to ask Dr. Johnson questions. I would like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. In addition, we have a brief evaluation form for the webinar that we'll share at the end of the webinar, and we encourage you to fill it out. So with that, welcome, Dr. Johnson. Are you ready to answer some questions?
Sure. This is exciting. Let's do it.
Okay. So what are PFAS or per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances?
So PFAS are really a large family of man-made chemicals, like thousands of chemicals. They've been widely used for decades. I think we here in Minnesota often think it's sort of a Minnesota specific chemical, but in fact, PFAS chemicals have been used all over the world, since the 1940s. And so it's not just a Minnesota exposure, we do see it elsewhere. Unlike a lot of other chemicals, we don't have a lot of health information or toxicology information on PFAS because they were put into common usage long before the EPA was around to require any kind of testing, safety testing on the chemicals. So we are learning more and more every day. And in fact, I would say that the body of knowledge that we're starting to develop is just growing by leaps and bounds over the last 10 years.
Okay, so why is it important to know what PFAS are?
So PFAS are all around us. They're all over in the environment. They're in the soil, they're in the water, they're in the air in some places, and they're in consumer products, and they're in our food supply in some places as well. And so we're all being exposed to them. Some PFAS can build up and stay in the body for long periods of time. And even after you stop being exposed, it can take many years for the PFAS to leave. So that's one of the hallmarks of this group of chemicals. There are some, because there are thousands, that don't last for years in your body. They are a little quicker, but generally when we think about PFAS, we do really think about that potential to be in the body and interact with our bodies for long periods of time.
Okay. So how are people exposed to PFAS?
So most people in Minnesota are going to be exposed to PFAS through consumer products. which I will talk a little bit more about later. Also, though, we do have, some contamination in our groundwater in Minnesota. We first discovered contamination from PFAS in the groundwater in 2002. And at that time, when we talked to the EPA about it, they said, oh, that sounds like a Minnesota problem and it's not a big deal. So things have really changed, right? Because we do see PFAS in the water all over the world now. So the more we know, the more we're finding they're kind of everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you are in the state of Minnesota and you're using products that, and you're using them safely, you still may be having that PFAS exposure.
So how do I know if a particular product has PFAS? And are there alternatives?
So that's kind of a tricky question. Some products will say specifically that they do not have PFAS in them, and that may or may not be true. There's been testing that's been done across the US, and occasionally, companies that say, oh, this is a PFAS-free product, it in fact has been found to have PFAS in it. Companies are not required to announce that there is PFAS in a given product. And so that can be really the tricky part of understanding if you're being exposed through products or not. I think a really easy way to kind of think about products that might have PFAS. Is this a grease-resistant product? Is this a stain-resistant product? Is this a water-resistant product? All of these things generally contain PFAS, and they may contain quite elevated levels of PFAS. So one way to reduce your exposure is to choose a product that doesn't have that property. So for example, a men's dress shirt that's stain resistant probably has PFAS in the fabric. If you can find a men's dress shirt that does not have that stain resistance to it, it probably does not have PFAS in it. There's no way to tell for sure, but if you kind of look for those categories, that's a good way to sort of point yourself in the right direction.
Okay, great. That's actually really, really helpful because I have a tablecloth that says it's stain resistant, so I should be careful with it. Okay, so how do PFAS affect my family or my health?
So again, as I said, that we don't know a great deal about health impacts from PFAS. It's something that we're really, really starting to learn now. When chemicals are tested, they're tested on laboratory animals. And what we found, especially over the past 10 years, is that laboratory animals just are not as sensitive as humans, especially infants and children, excuse me, to PFAS.
Mhm.
So what we're beginning to learn is that PFAS can impact the immune system of children. It can pass from mothers to infants during nursing. It can also pass the placenta and actually partition with the fetus. So be higher in concentration with the fetus than with the mother. And, because moms in the US have PFAS in their bloodstream, when their babies are born, they also have PFAS in their bloodstream. And in fact, a lot of studies have shown that babies are born with the exact same concentration of PFAS in their blood at birth that their mothers have after years and years of exposure to PFAS. So what I think we'll know more in the coming years, especially with studies like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that there's a number of studies and cohorts in children, for example, that are specifically exploring the impact of the PFAS on child health and development.
Yes.
So who measures PFAS, and can I measure PFAS in my home?
So there is not like a state program to go out and measure PFAS in your home to see where it is and what products that it is in. If you are on city water, which a good way to know if you're on city water or not is, do you get a bill in the mail for water? If you do get a bill in the mail, chances are if you own your home, you're probably on city water. City water is tested for PFAS. And the federal government has not required that testing. It'll start shortly here, I think in the fall. But Minnesota has had a voluntary program to go out and test big water systems to make sure that the water is safe for everyone from PFAS. So we're kind of ahead of the game in Minnesota for that. PFAS is really tricky to test for. In order to do it, you have to follow a kind of a strict set of rules to get ready to do it, because otherwise you'll contaminate your own samples. So generally, we just don't recommend that people do their own water sampling or do any sort of product testing for that reason. You're going to get a false positive probably.
Yeah, that's because PFAS is everywhere, and
It's
you have to
everywhere.
be careful that your collection container doesn't contain it,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. So what is the Minnesota state government through the Minnesota Department of Health and the Pollution Control Agency doing about PFAS? And specifically, what is that new legislation that was recently passed in Minnesota regarding PFAS?
Yeah, so first I'd like to talk about the legislation just a little bit. So this was actually a product of citizens being very, very concerned and working with the MPCA to help convince the legislature that this was the right thing to do. So some of the things that they have gotten in the last session was more funding for PFAS testing. And that's going to include not only water supplies, which is kind of where we've been so far with PFAS in Minnesota, but it's also going to be testing in fish, testing in the soils, more testing in air. We have some air testing already. And then also product testing. And along with that product testing is a PFAS ban of non-essential uses of PFAS in Minnesota, which it's going to take a little bit here to get it going and to really understand what it's going to look like. But it is a really great just effort by citizens and people that work for the state, really bringing it to the attention of the legislature, and getting some action on this, because we've known at the state agencies since 2002 that we have these chemicals that don't break down in the environment. And it's taken a really long time to get the attention of everyone. And I think it's a great story, because I think without the citizens who are very passionate about it, these bans would not have passed in this legislature. So that's sort of my, that's me telling you, if you're passionate about PFAS, please get in touch with your legislator. Currently, MPCA and MDH have a pretty strong partnership, and we sometimes work with the DNR too on PFAS issues. And kind of the last 20 years, we've really spent a long time saying, well, how big is the problem? Where is it? And how much is out there, right, in our environment in Minnesota? And then also the health department has worked pretty hard on saying, well, what are people's exposures looking like? What are people drinking it? And what does that mean? Does it make them sick? What do we know about the health impacts? And so we've done a lot of the groundwork for that. And I think now with these bans and a lot of the newer research that's coming around, I think we're really poised for action on PFAS in Minnesota in a big way.
That's great. That's great. So how can I find out about PFAS levels in the tap water in my home, either municipal or public water versus well water?
Sure. So Minnesota does not have a specific program for private wells. And I would say yet, I do work with the water policy manager who is working to find funding and set up a program to start doing testing for private wells, because a lot of Minnesotans are on their own wells. So at this time, there's no specific program for that. As I said, if you get a water bill and you own your own house, you're likely already being tested for PFAS. There has been a huge effort over the last 2 years to get to every water system in Minnesota and make sure that it's tested for PFAS, so that if there is PFAS, it can be addressed and we can make the water safe. There's a really great web tool called the Interactive Dashboard for PFAS Testing in Drinking Water that's available from the Minnesota Department of Health. And you can go in and you can look up your water system, and it's going to show you the results. So you can see what was found or what was not found. They also calculate what's called a health index. And that health index is an attempt to look at when there's more than one PFAS present. Maybe alone they aren't a problem, but if they're combined, maybe they are, right? So we're not just looking at single PFAS. We're looking now, I think, up to 6 specifically that Minnesota has safe numbers for, and this is going to expand over time.
And by safe numbers, you mean that they've established a concentration that's safe for human consumption.
Right. So the way water safe, I call them safe, because it's a little bit, it's shorthand for a mouthful. But the point of these numbers is to protect everyone in Minnesota. So that's always our intent when we set forth to calculate the numbers. So we're looking at who are the most sensitive individuals that could be impacted by PFAS, and then at the very lowest levels, what do we see that's concerning? So we're always trying to make sure that we're getting to everybody in Minnesota, not just the sensitive individuals, but maybe those who drink the most water too. So because that can be two separate populations. So.
Okay, great. And Andrea, can you post that to everyone? Oh, you did. Okay, great. Awesome. So the link is in the chat for this dashboard. Okay. What can I do if a test shows high levels of PFAS in my tap water?
So I think, maybe people are accustomed to being notified that there's something in their water if it's an urgent or emergent situation. So for example, if you have bacteria in your water, your local water system may tell you to boil your water. PFAS is a different situation because it takes a long time to build up in the body. It means that we can take time to respond and make sure we're responding in the best way possible. So what's going to happen if you have higher levels of PFAS in your tap water is that your water system operator will contact you and let you know. But at the same time, they're also going to tell you this is the plan and this is what we're going to do to reduce your exposures. And this is the timeline of which it will happen.
Okay, is there any value in me putting a filter system in my home?
So that's going to be somewhat of an individual decision. So if you think that you're a person who might have health impacts from chemicals, it doesn't hurt. You could do something as simple as have a filter on your refrigerator, or you could get a Pure or Brita pitcher, or even there's the ones that snap on the faucet. You could even go so far as to get like an RO unit, an under counter RO unit. Those run $200 to $300. I would say if you don't have a specific health concern, or even if you do, you might want to consult your physician to see if this makes sense for you. But generally, the tap water from coming out of community public water supplies is very safe in the Twin Cities and throughout greater Minnesota because it is routinely tested. So I always tell people I've worked on water in Minnesota for a really long time, and I drink it straight out of the tap myself, and it's the St. Paul city water that comes out of the Mississippi River ultimately. So I'm a big believer in the safety of city water. I think Minnesota does a really good job.
Great, thank you. Are there resources in Minnesota to help with the cost of mitigating PFAS in tap water if I have a well?
Okay, so yeah, this is another one that has a little bit of a detail to it. So if you have a private well for drinking water, and it's included in an existing environmental investigation by MPCA, and is also near a known source of contamination, you probably are going to be contacted by MPCA. They're going to come and they're going to sample for you, and then they're going to tell you what your results are. They could issue you what's called a well advisory letter, which basically says this well has issues, and it talks about what your results are and what they recommend you do. If this is the situation, then there's going to be options offered to you. Could be short-term bottled water until a filter could be installed. It could be drilling a new well. There's always lots of different options for that. If you have a private well and you're not associated with known environmental investigations, it's absolutely it's up to the homeowner to deal with the situation, basically. That's kind of the way that it is in Minnesota. There is no fund that's been set aside to help people treat PFAS on their home taps unless you're part of one of those investigations.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, in addition to what the government is doing, are there other groups advocating to reduce our exposure to PFAS, and where can I contact them?
Sure. So one group that I'm actually a huge fan of is the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. They're a legal group, and they do a lot of advocacy up at the Minnesota State Capitol. They did a lot of advocacy around the PFAS bans this last session. And it was, they're part of the story of how this was able to get passed this year. I would also say the Environmental Working Group, or EWG, is another great place for information. The one thing that I would caution about EWG is that they do like to get a little excitement out of people. And so sometimes the way they present data might be different than the way that Minnesota would present the exact same data. We have a different way of speaking about PFAS. I wouldn't say that we disagree. We just have different ways of speaking. But again, really great resource.
Great, thank you. So if I want to get more information about PFAS, where can I find this more general information about this group of chemicals?
So the health department, the Minnesota Department of Health, does have a website that is pretty comprehensive as far as health, drinking water, fish consumption, gardening, it's kind of all the topics that we've collected over the past 20 years as we've been working on this. It's a really great source that can help you understand what the scope of the health impacts could be. There's a lot of great information there for that. And a lot of good links too. And then also the Pollution Control Agency has another really good website. I think if you just search for PFAS, it comes up. I see here, there's a link specifically to their PFAS page. And then the ATSDR, which is a federal part of the CDC, I believe, has a site about PFAS. And we often work at the health department, we often work sort of hand in hand with ATSDR on a lot of outreach for physicians and nurses and sort of the medical component of it. We work with them on, but they have a lot of really great stuff too.
Okay, great. That's terrific. Well, thank you for answering all these questions I had. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now to tell everybody about the 10,000 Family Study. As one of the main researchers of this program, I would invite you to consider participating in our study, because these types of studies that we're doing, where we're measuring the levels of different chemicals in people and in their environment, and trying to see if they're associated with health outcomes, is really part of a crucial piece of evidence that's used to try to change policies to reduce our exposures. So we are going to be measuring PFAS in our participants in 4 different ways. First, participants 3 years and over will be wearing a silicone wristband for 7 days that will collect, it actually collects the PFAS from the environment. We will be collecting blood sample from adults as well as 12 to 17-year-olds who are willing to give a blood sample, so that we can measure PFAS levels in the serum. We will be using the MDH's levels of PFAS in the drinking water from the municipal sources. And then there's a questionnaire that gets filled out. And so a number of those questions will help guide us to the potential for you to have been exposed to PFAS. We plan to share aggregate or the group data results to study and what they mean to study participants. We are currently actually doing a subset of samples from about 400 participants as we're getting sort of pilot testing the different assays, and these results will be shared once the analyses are completed. Availability of individual results will be pending future funding. And so I want to tell you how you can join the 10,000 Family Study. The steps are as follows. First, the first step is to fill out a 5-minute eligibility survey, which is available online at z.umn.edu/10KFS-PFAS. To fill it out, you must be 18 years at least 18 years old and live in Minnesota, but the other members of your family can be any age and live in Minnesota or any of the neighboring states, such as Iowa, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and North Dakota. They don't need to live with you. So the next step is you would invite family members. So once you receive the invitation to join the study, which will happen by email, you will need to send the web link to other adults in your family or registered children under 18 years old. At this time, then you become a participating family. After that, there's a health questionnaire that each member of the family will receive through an email link to fill out online, and parents and or guardians fill it out for children under the age of 18. There will also be a health visit scheduled for people who live in the Twin Cities metro area or in Austin. They're invited to a health visit in person. If you live in greater Minnesota, you can you can instead sign up for a mobile health visit in your home at a time that's convenient for your family. The health visit is when we give you the silicone wristband to measure PFAS in the air around you, and we will take a blood sample from adults. And then we're also interested in radon. So every household in the study gets a radon kit sent to them in the wintertime. And then there will be follow-up questionnaires that occur every 2 years to ask about any changes in your health. So we hope that you will consider joining our study if you haven't already. So now I would like to have Sara come back and we'll answers the questions that you have. Please put your questions in the question answer section of the Zoom link, and we will address those. So there is a question from Amy. She's outraged that PFAS disclosing is not required on consumer products. How can I choose dental floss and other mouth cleaning products without PFAS?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I've been working in this field for, well, more than a decade. And I have spent many minutes in the oral care aisle trying to figure out what has PFAS and what doesn't, and it's not marked. I can just say that one particular brand of Oral-B Glide is like sky high levels. Like it's like renowned among people who work in PFAS. Don't use that particular product. The way that I look at it is I say the simpler the better. Go with floss that isn't promising, that your teeth are going to fly when you're done with it, right? You want to do something really simple, it's just going to get your teeth clean. And I don't know about to my knowledge, I don't know about PFAS in like oral rinses, and I haven't seen data in toothpaste, but there could be. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think more and more people will start, the analytical chemists out there will start measuring things and finding out what the sources are. So Lucas says that many reputable sources say that the primary danger from nonstick pans that use PFAS is the off-gassing that happens when the pan is heated too hot. Is there now a concern for PFAS being released from pans into food, even during normal low temperature use?
So I don't know that has been demonstrated, but I think one of the big problems is that, people love their pans and they hold on to them for a long time and they start to chip, and then you get chunks of PFAS in your food. And so, it's kind of like one of these things where it's just a really good idea to reduce your exposure by going to a different type of pan. I have gone to porcelain pans, but you really got to research those to make sure they don't have PFAS somehow coating the porcelain. But so there are other options out there. Cast iron is a really natural, old school way to avoid PFAS. So there are other ways, to not have eggs sticking to your pan.
Right. I've done that. I've switched over to these pans that you have to season, and they get nice and they develop their own stick-free over time. Another question is, are there or will there be new regulations in place, at least for Minnesota, to ban or control the exposure of PFAS? So I think
what I can say about that is that there is a great recognition by the state agencies and scientists that work in them that people are being exposed through a lot of different ways, right? It's not just in your water, it's not just maybe in your air because you live near a manufacturing facility. It's kind of like everywhere at this point in time. So I think there is definitely a focus on reducing the types of exposures that people are having. An example of that I can give you that's pretty almost specific to Minnesota, but at least specific to cold climates, is that ski wax for cross-country skiing has tons and tons of PFAS in it, and it has for years and years. It's just been used because it works really well, and it's not necessary. There are other alternatives. And so what's going to happen, hopefully, is that if we don't ban ski wax with PFAS specifically, we're going to get the PFAS out of it. So the ski waxes with a lot of PFAS aren't sold in Minnesota. And then you've got to look at the bigger picture with PFAS. If it's not on the skis, it can't get in the snow, it can't melt into the lakes, it can't get into the fish, right? So you've really got to look at this really big picture with PFAS and try to say, how do we reduce it in the environment for the long term, because it does not break down. So, that's always going to be part of the picture. And if we can't reduce it in the environment, we can't reduce the human exposures ultimately.
Okay, thank you. So anonymous attendee wants to know if you have any insight on why so many more years of production before the PFAS ban takes effect. Related, do we have any insights on what type of compounds companies will begin to use as an alternative to PFAS, concerning we will be in the dark ages for years, just as we've been with PFAS. I mean, that's true. I mean, bisphenol A got replaced with bisphenol S, and when you do the toxicological studies, they're basically kind of similar. Yeah.
So there's a worldwide group of scientists who are very concerned very much with that issue of green replacement or appropriate replacement. And so as companies are coming out and saying, oh, look, we don't need PFAS because we have this fantastic chemical, a lot of them are just sort of like of their own accord doing the testing and showing these aren't any better, right? And I do know that certain states, like California is the one that comes to mind, they actually require that if you're going to do a chemical replacement, that you prove that it is a safer chemical, not only for the environment, but for human health. So that's kind of, an interesting thing that I know way back in the day when I was in graduate school. I know like green chemistry was kind of the new up and coming thing. And I think that beyond just green chemistry as an environmental thing, people are starting to think about from the human health perspective, maybe we need to dig into that a little deeper before we put something on the market. As far as it taking 20 years for the bans to go into effect. So I don't think that there's some, conspiracy here. I think that, because we didn't know anything about PFAS, especially here in Minnesota, we did not have access to 3M's toxicology tests. So we didn't know what they had seen. And they were not compelled to give them to us, right? And they were sort of our local company that was producing it, although there are other companies that produce it as well, to be fair. But we didn't know toxicologically what was going on. So it's just taken a long time for us to really understand what the impact was going to be to humans. And I think what has accelerated it greatly is that it became very clear in the last 5 years that it passes through breast milk, and that infants and children and fetuses are far more sensitive to it than adults are. And that some of those health impacts that we're seeing are troubling because they have to do with the proper development of children. For example, the thyroid disruptions that they see in pregnant women. Well, you don't want thyroid disruptions in pregnant women because it affects the development of the brain in the fetus, right? So some of I guess I describe it as there's a constellation of effects that we're starting to put together that all sort of point to developmental issues. And so I think that has created a sense of urgency around PFAS. Definitely that was not there in the past. You can tell people that they're going to get high cholesterol from a drug for 20 years and they just don't care, right? But you start telling them that their children might have developmental issues, or they might have a baby that's born with low birth weight, which puts them at high risk for many other things. And it'll create that sense of urgency, because certainly we don't want to have this problem happen in early life that can impact them for their entire lives as a result of a chemical exposure. The other thing about PFAS that's kind of different is that, with chemicals, generally the way you figure out what's going on is that you take a group of people who are exposed and you compare them to a group of people who were not exposed, and then you compare their health outcomes. There's other ways you can do it, but that's a real common way that it's done. With PFAS, we don't have an unexposed group. We only have those who are highly exposed and those who are less exposed. And so it's really hard to tease out what those health endpoints really, really are. So, again, I think that that's really what we're working with. And like studies like this are so important, because they're filling in some of the blanks and are going to give us really useful information that we haven't had to make decisions around to help people be safe.
Hey, so Mark would like to know if you have an opinion about what the best water pitcher to use to filter your water.
I don't. That's really outside my area. I'm not a water treatment person. So I don't. What I can say is that regardless of what water treatment you use, you have to fix the filter. Set yourself a timer on your phone, or put it on your refrigerator or whatever, but you've got to change that filter out on a regular. Otherwise, it just ends up washing back out and you're drinking far more of whatever it was you were removing.
Yeah, it's important to keep those things within their time usage. So Sammy noticed that you had mentioned a safe concentration for some PFAS in the water. Is that just at the state level, or is that also at the federal level?
So those numbers have been developed over the last 20 plus years here in Minnesota for us. There's other states that have done it as well. New Jersey is a great partner of ours, New York, California, Maine, all kinds of people, New Hampshire. But the numbers that we have are very specific to Minnesota. And we look at things a little differently than the feds do, which kind of irritates them sometimes, because we are always looking at short-term exposures as a real problem, because it includes pregnancy, right? So we're looking at pregnant women and infants and children, and the federal government tends to, when they develop safe water numbers, they look at, well, what happens after 40 years, or what happens after 20 years, right? So Minnesota does things a little bit differently. So if you were to go, online and compare our numbers to what the federal government is now proposing, because they're proposing 2, we have 6, because that's really all we can do right now. But you would see that our numbers are usually lower, and that have an emphasis on that early life piece, really trying to make sure that we're protecting, our infants and children.
That's good. That's good. I actually have the same question. Brian wants to know, that if I have a nonstick pan or product that I wish to dispose of, what is the responsible way to do that? I mean, because I have this, I've gotten rid of all my nonstick pans, but I have one left, and I've been thinking, well, if I give it to Goodwill, somebody else is getting exposed. If I put it in the garbage, does that mean that it's going to get into the environment somehow?
So it's like such a huge conundrum with these kind of products, right? Because, and especially like when people say, should I filter my water? And one of my gut reactions is don't do it, because what are we going to do with your filter covered in PFAS? We're going to put it in the landfill. And then what happens? Eventually the landfill leaks and it goes into the groundwater, and then we've all got it in our tap water again. We don't have a good way to destroy PFAS yet. I mean, there's sort of a race on to figure that out. But it hasn't. Usually if you try to destroy it with high heat, what happens is you just get far more toxic fluorinated compounds, which that's not obviously a desired outcome. I think occasionally there are these stories that come out like, oh, problem solved. This university figured out how to, break down PFAS, but usually, the devil's in the details, right? And if you look at it, you find out that it only works in a test tube, and that's scaling it up to, being able to take care of all of us who want to put stuff in a landfill. It's not going to work. So what I would say is just do your best not to buy it in the first place moving forward. And that there really isn't a right answer for getting rid of it, because no matter what way you get rid of it, it'll probably end up, in a landfill until we figure out a way to get rid of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know there's a faculty in my department who's looking, and he's got some material that sequesters PFAS as you move it through. And I think then but it has to be put somewhere once it's done, but it is something to think about. Okay. Then so the next question is firefighting foam this is from Jiro, that firefighting foam contains PFAS. Are fire departments training grounds a potential source of groundwater pollution? Have there been any studies on that?
So that's a pretty common thing, actually. Unfortunately, airports also have a big problem with it. There is actually a relatively new Superfund site that's being developed up by Duluth. It is the Air National Guard base. They use tons of firefighting foam, right? And so now it's in the groundwater, it's in the fish around there. You know, what happens in those situations is that, you know, MPCA comes in and figures out what's the source, how big is the problem, who all's affected, because sometimes just because the Air Force Base has foam, it doesn't mean that everybody else who lives around it doesn't also have it in their water, because groundwater travels, right? So they do that, and then they work with the Superfund program to get funding to clean it up, and they do clean it up out of the environment. But you know, most of the time, if people are talking about firefighting foam, you'll hear AFFF, which is the type of firefighting foam that has been used. I sat through hearings up at the Capitol this year, trying to ban the use of AFFF in Minnesota, except for under certain like aircraft crashes, they need it because it'll put out the greasiness of the petroleum fires, I guess, or whatever. But I'm not certain that ever went through. But I really do think that because using firefighting foam is creating these huge liabilities for the people who are using it, that it will be phased out.
Yeah, and I do know people who are studying firefighters that are interested in measuring the levels of PFAS in the firefighters before and after they've done a procedure, especially during training procedures.
There's a researcher by the name of Graham Peasley who did a whole bunch of research on firefighter turnout gear, showing just how toxic it was, and he was really looking at PFAS. And you know, it wasn't just the turnout gear, it was that after they took it off and they went home and they're sitting on their couch, it was all over the couch because they were bringing it home with them. And then their families had very elevated levels of it in their blood as well. So it's a known hazard of being a firefighter.
Yeah. Somebody provided a link to sources for info on filters, so hopefully that got put into the chat where everybody can see it. And then the final question we have is regarding PFAS. Is there any noticeable long-term effects? And I'm going to say health effects, most likely.
So as I said earlier, it's really hard to point your finger when you have an environmental exposure, especially when so many people are exposed. For something like asbestos, where it's a very limited number of people who would ever be exposed to it, and then there's this very particular form of cancer, mesothelioma, that occurs, we can look at those and say there's a cause and effect relationship. Many of the endpoints for PFAS are not specific to PFAS. And so it's really hard to say this adult has high cholesterol or has elevated liver enzymes as a result of their PFAS exposure and not something else that they've been exposed to along the way. It's really hard to say. I think the shorter term effects are much clearer that we see in children and infants and fetuses. That stuff is just, it's hard to miss when you start looking at the data. But the long-term stuff is a lot harder to nail down. A lot of the studies that were done to understand what the long-term effects could be have been done in people who are really highly exposed. And then, you know, as a risk assessor, then I would say, well, let's try and work backwards and see if we you know, bring the levels down, would you still see you know, that kind of an effect? And it's you know, it's a calculation. It's not a cause and effect thing. So it's a little different. But having said that, though, I don't think that exposure to PFAS is trivial. I just think we haven't identified it yet.
Right. And so that brings me back to the 10,000 family study, where we are interested in looking at the impact of perfluorinated substances on blood cancer risk. And it's our hypothesis, because PFAS are known to, for example, to suppress the immune system, that by suppressing the immune surveillance of cancer, that might actually increase your risk. And so we will be comparing levels of PFAS and looking at a precursor biomarker of blood cancer. All of these precursor markers will turn into cancer. Not all of them. If you get blood cancer, you have this precursor marker, but people who have not all people who have the precursor marker will get blood cancer. So hopefully that's clear. What I just said is a little convoluted. But so that is what we want to look for in our study. So I would like to encourage you all to consider joining our study and to consider taking our 5-minute eligibility survey, which is at z.umn.edu/10KFS-PFAS. I think we'll put that should be in the chat. If you have any questions or feedback for the 10,000 families, you can email us at TENKFS, 10KFS, spelled out, at umn.edu. And please fill out our 5-minute question anonymous evaluation form for today's session, which you can access on the link that will be put in the chat. We really value your feedback, and we are planning on doing more of these kind of educational webinars to help people understand the health effects of exposures. The recording for today's webinar will be available soon on the 10,000 Families YouTube channel. Somebody just asked that question. You can search it up on YouTube or link to it on the 10,000 Families website, which is 10kfs.umn.edu. And I believe we've also will be posting this on our Facebook, because it's been streamed live on Facebook. So I'm assuming that it will be showing up there as well. I think there might be some bit of a delay, but it should be posted as soon as possible. So with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Fossen Johnson for joining us today and answering all these questions. It's very important work that you do, and I'm so glad that you take time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us. So thank you very much, and thank everybody for their attendance.